Hello and welcome to AITPM News. And in this week's news stories we hear of the Commuter parking inquiry by the New South Wales Government, basic traffic signal design for modelers and designers, and two history stories: what shaped Sydney, a vision of a penal colony or a great city, and what gave it its shape. It was transport from the beginning. The New South Wales Legislative Assembly, the lower house, is conducting an inquiry into commuter car parking in New South Wales. The terms of reference are to look at the effectiveness of policies and programs, processes for selecting locations, the potential for restricted access or user pays, alternative modes for first mile, last mile travel, and any other related matters. The committee has already taken written submissions. The need for commuter parking is well accepted. The industry body, Parking Australia, wrote in general terms about the significance of commuter parking and said, in part, wrapping commuter parking in retail, shops, eateries, fitness centres integrates it into the community. This mixed-use approach makes the parking structure more attractive as an urban community, not just a commuting place. But there needs to be very specific traffic engineering approaches to ensure that it is used for its intended purpose and in an effective manner. There is a strong push to ensure that commuter parking is used for commuters. Suggestions to the inquiry include gated access to all park and ride facilities, access to be granted with the same card that is used to purchase a fare, a small charge for the cost of parking, a much larger charge if the car is left and no return ticket is purchased, a possible section of guaranteed parking that can be booked online, a parking space levy to be hypothecated back to public transport, and all stations to have kiss and ride drop-off facilities. The inquiry will start hearings on the 16th of October. The New South Wales branch of the AITPM is holding a Back to Basics forum on the 26th of October 2017. Long-time AITPM member Alan Finlay will be presenting a paper titled Insight to Basic Traffic Signal Design.
Sydney has a very proud history of developing a very sophisticated traffic signal management system, SCATS, and it continues to be developed and enhanced. But it's important that people understand the basic principles that underlie the operation of traffic signals generally, and that's the sort of things that I'll be trying to cover in my presentation. It's particularly important for people who might be modelling the operation of traffic signals, and so obviously a lot of consultants are involved in developing models and assessing the efficiency of networks, and increasingly council traffic engineers need to be across the results of those sorts of models because they'll be assessing the results and making recommendations for things like development applications and other things that are going to have an impact on traffic flows. Just a very simple thing, and one of the most common errors I see in SIDRA is SIDRA defaults to what we would call long walks in the pedestrian features. So if you don't actively take steps to turn off a particular function, SIDRA will assume that every pedestrian feature has the walk go almost for the length of the phase. And so the flashing red man will operate for the last however long it needs to be for the length of the crossing. But in practice, in New South Wales practice certainly, it's more typical that the walk is only displayed for about 6 or 8 seconds at the start of the phase, and then it straight away goes into flashing red man. If it's left to its own devices, SIDRA will make every pedestrian crossing a long walk, whereas in practice most pedestrian crossings have short walks.
Information about the forum can be found on our website. When Governor Phillips started European settlement in Sydney, he thought about more than just a penal colony. He saw an opportunity to build a great city. Part of his vision was wide main thoroughfares and elegant buildings. Later, Governor Macquarie also had grand visions, including large boulevards as a key element of a boundless city. Bob Meyer is the head of planning for Cox Architecture and is an avid historian of planning and its effects on our lives. He notes that Governor Phillips' Navy experience was more than just how to sail ships.
Philip was very worldly. He had travelled all over the world because he was lent to the Portuguese Navy by the British Navy and had sailed to ports like Rio de Janeiro and those areas. He knew all these harbours and cities. And again, you know, when he sailed into Port Jackson, he could say that this is the finest harbour he's ever seen. And he had seen a lot of harbours in the world. So, but he wanted to do something, but I think the government in England thought this was a convict settlement. Why waste money on it and have wide streets and what have you? Because the early planners, or the people interested in planning and who had been a bit worldly who came here, always spouted about Paris. Because Paris was, you know, Louis XIV, I think it was, and Haussmann, his major prefect, just bulldozed great boulevards throughout the working class suburbs of Paris and made it what we know it as today. But again, I think the people in Whitehall were not that impressed with a convict settlement being of that nature.
We will have more reflections from Bob's extended interview, including making a video to cover what has been some wonderful reflections of how and why a great city like Sydney developed the way it did. We continue our chat with Bob Meyer on the history of Sydney. Transport always has a big impact on every city, and in Sydney it started from the very beginning.
The whole idea was to try and move to Parramatta because that's where the food was produced. But the problem was that the First Fleet could not get up the river because it was, at a certain point, the keels of the First Fleet hit the bottom of the river, and there's an old Navy term called kissing point. That was the kissing point where the keel hit. Therefore, we all know Kissing Point Road. When we go over that, we'll know where the keels hit. So they couldn't settle in Parramatta. They would have liked to have. They would have liked to have had Parliament House there, but they had to turn back and settle in Sydney.
It's interesting that the First Fleet boats, of course, sailed across the ocean, but then had to be used within a local sense in Sydney.
Exactly, and because they couldn't use the boats there, they had to use the long boats, which were like the lifeboats of the First Fleet. So they had to row them up the rivers, and it took them quite a few hours to get from Sydney to Parramatta or up to Windsor. But at one stage, in about 1830s or so, there were more people living in those outer western areas, Windsor, Richmond, Parramatta, than there were in the inner parts of Sydney. And there are tables of that, I think 1850 or so, where the numbers were counted.